Hey, what's up guys, it's your man JB here, and in this video we're taking a look at this machine, the router, the hand router. This is a really popular and common tool for woodworkers, and it's actually thought of as the kind of second most important tool for woodworking. So if you are looking at getting into woodworking and you've never used a router before and you want to use one, this video is going to be for you. It's the basics of how to use a hand router, and for those of you who are experienced with routers and woodworking and this probably isn't for you and might not learn anything, so this is a basic introduction to the router and how to use it. So to start with then, what is a router? Well, we know it's a woodworking tool, but essentially it's a motor that spins a bit, and we'll look at the bits in a moment. It spins the bit in here at a really high speed. We're talking up to 28,000 revs per minute. Now that's some serious speed. Now here's an example of a bit, and this is actually a kitchen worktop bit because it is quite long, and basically the bit goes into a collet which fits into the spindle here, which spins really fast, and then you can use that to cut and slot and all sorts. You do have a range of different bits, but basically with a router you can slot, you can groove, you can rebate, you can profile, you can trim, you can plunge holes, you can do so many different things. It's a really versatile bit of kit, but you've got to know how to use it safely. Let's have a look at a few common bits that you would use in a router. So to begin with, we have these straight bits, which are basically a straight cutter, and you can get those in various sizes, so different widths, different size of cutters, different lengths. As I said already, that is for a kitchen worktop because kitchen worktops tend to be quite deep. You've also got router bits like this. Now this is a 35mm router bit, and this is actually ideal for using to put cabinet hinges in doors, so that's a really good tool, that one. Got another one here, and that would just be used for trimming laminate. If you were laminating a board, you could use that to trim it. And then we've also got these router bits that have bearings on. So if you've got a router bit with a bearing, it means you can run that bearing along the edge of the board, and you can put this kind of shape or profile on it, and we'll have a go at that in a moment. You've got router bits which have a pointed edge. Now this has got a protective covering on at the moment, but that will give you like a V groove. And you've also got, and you can get cutters like this which are shaped again to give you a fancy profile or edging on your board. So let's have a look at the router itself, and this one in particular is called a plunge router, and the reason for that is because you can plunge the router into the work like so. You can push it down, lock it into position, and then you can do whatever you need to do. Now you'd only need to lock it into position if you were then going to create a slot, for example. If you were just going to make a hole, you could just plunge down to the correct depth and then back up again. So the other type of router is a fixed depth router, which doesn't have this plunge function. You can still set the depth of the cutter, but you haven't got the option to plunge it into your workpiece. This is a variable speed router. You can get fixed speed routers, but this one you can set from number 1 up to number 6, and that means this router will run, or the RPM of this motor is 11,500 to 28,000 revs per minute. Now the rule is the bigger the cutter, the slower the speed. I'm not going to explain about speeds for different cutters, but let's just say, for example, you're using this bit in the router, you're definitely going to want to have that on a much slower speed because it's such a big tool compared to this one. when you're using a plunge router, you have got this little catch on the back here, which means you can lock it into position. So it's a really good idea to get used to the handle and the feel of a router and being able to plunge down and lock that into position while keeping the router in that same fixed position. What you don't want to be doing is trying to lock that off as the router starts coming back up again or starts moving. So good idea to get used to that function if you're going to plunge with it. What you can also do with a plunge router is set this stop here to different depths. You can adjust this rod here so you can get exactly the right depth, and you can set this to different heights as well. So it gives you a lot of different depths that you can cut to, particularly if you want to go really deep and make a deep cut but you want to do it in sections. You can just keep dropping that down. Also, once you've plunged that into position, what you can do is use this knob here to actually finely adjust the depth of your router or the bit. Now let's have a go putting a bit in the router then, and what you will have on the end of this spindle is your collet. So this is the collet which holds the bit, which then goes into the router motor or the spindle, and at the moment that's actually a 1/2 inch collet. So having a look at these bits here, these have all got a 1/2 inch shank to them. So this section is called the shank of a router bit, and that basically goes into the collet. So let's put, I don't know, let's put this straight bit in for now. What you do want to do is make sure you've got at least 2/3 or 3/4 of the shank of the bit inside the collet. You don't want to have it hanging right out here. Go into that as deep as you can, but not too close to where the cutter starts. So I would generally go about 3/4. Somewhere about there would be perfect. Now you can put that in there and then put the collet on the router. It's up to you, but generally this for me stays on the router. We just spin that on. There we go. So that generally stays on because you can get your bit in and out from there. Look. So the collet does stay quite loose until you tighten it up. Now what we've got here, this little push button will actually lock the spindle, so we can then use the spanner to tighten it up. So I'm just going to put the bit into the collet there. There we go, and we'll spin that round, and as soon as it starts to tighten, the whole spindle itself is spinning. So what we'll do, we'll push this button in here, turn that, and that actually locks that into position. So what I can now do is take the spanner and just tighten that off. Now you don't want to go mega tight, because actually the rotation of the spindle locks the collet into position anyway. So don't over tighten it, but you know, do make sure you've given it a little bit of a tug. Right, that bit is now set in the router. Now the more and more you use a router, the more you'll get to grips with how you're going to actually use it. And what I mean by that is, so I've got this straight bit in here, but what am I going to do with that? Am I going to do it kind of just do something freehand, or are you going to use some kind of fence and use the straight edge here of the base to actually run along? So what we'll do for the first demonstration is use this as a fence to put a groove in a piece of timber using this straight bit. Now I've got my workpiece here, and I've just screwed a bit of timber to the top, and I'm going to use that as my fence. That way it's going to give me a nice straight line through the piece of work. Now this is screwed down into the bench as well, but if it isn't, it's really important that you get yourself some decent clamp, something like this, to actually hold your piece down, because this is a serious bit of kit, and this will fly, believe me. So make sure your workpiece is nice and secure, and then you won't have any problems. First thing we need to do then is to set the depth, and what I can do is just move this off the edge of the board, and I can just run that bit down the side of the timber until I get it at the desired depth. I haven't got a desired depth for this because it's just a demonstration, but I'm going to lock it off in that position. So now I've got the depth. If I wanted to, I could drop this stop down into position like so, and then I can take it off the plunge or take the lock off, and then that way I can push it down and I know that is going to be the depth. I've got two options. I can either hold it there or I can go down and lock it off. And if you've got a long groove to do, in this case it's fairly long, I would definitely be locking that off into position. I've done all the preparation without plugging it in, so don't keep it plugged in while you're messing around with this, because this won't leave you with much of a hand or fingers left, you know what I'm saying? So everything is in, locked up, and what we'll do, we'll just give it a quick spin just to check. Oh yes, this is a loud tool. Now whenever you use a router, make sure you've got safety goggles and ear protectors. So the benefit of having a plunge router is that you can do a slot like this without actually going all the way through. So we plunged here, moved along, and then plunged out. You can also use a flat bit to create a rebate along an edge. Most routers come with a guide just like this that you can attach to the base of the router, which then allows you to run along the edge of a board. If you are going to use your router to plunge holes in a piece of timber, then always a good idea to put a clamp on it if you can. It just saves it wandering off. To change the blade, all we're going to do is push this button in here, turn the spindle until that locks into position, and then we can just undo the collet. It will undo for a certain amount, then it will get tight again, and then you can just release it with the spanner, and then that will be enough to take the bit out. Next up, we're going to use one of these bits that have a bearing on, and the reason you have a bearing on a bit is because it allows the cutter to sit against the board and put that profile or whatever it is you've got on the cutter onto the timber. So that will just run along there like that, but deeper, and put that profile on the split of timber. So let's put this in the router and check it out. So with this rounded over bit in the router, I can plunge it down to the right depth, I can lock it off, and then we're ready to go. And there you can see how that cutter has put a round on that board there. So these are other router bits that I've got with bearings on. This one is for putting a slot in the end of a board. This one is for trimming, so if you've got a board on top of another board, you can run the bearing along one of the boards and then the cutter above or below will cut the board on top. And then we've also got a smaller rounded over bit, again that's got the bearing on, so that will just give you a smaller radius than the piece that we've just done. Now it's really important to understand that a router or a router bit will spin in a clockwise direction. So if I was going to be using this bit on this bit of timber, I'd want to be running the cutter along this edge here as I move forward. So you always want your work on the left of the cutter as you move forward. And the reason for that is so that the cutter is always cutting into the work as you're pushing it away. And if you go in the wrong direction and you bring it towards you, there's a big chance that the router will just pull away. As I showed you earlier, that is a 1/2 inch collet, and what you will sometimes get is a small cutter like this, which is on a much smaller 1/4 inch shank, and obviously that's not going to go in there. So what you can get are these sleeves which will allow you to put this 1/4 inch bit into the 1/2 inch shank, just like that. So there we have it, your beginner's guide to using a router. If you're using a router for the very first time, please be extra careful, make sure you know what you're doing, and do get some advice from an expert if necessary. No liability can be taken for any accidents you have after watching this video. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, why not leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, that would be really fantastic. And don't forget to subscribe, or go ahead if you're not a subscriber already, that would be awesome. And do keep an eye out for any future videos on woodworking tools. Fantastic guys, happy woodworking, and I'll see you on the next video.